On the 6th of November, 1895, a girl of 18 was led down the aisle of St. Thomas Church in New York with red rims around her eyes. She had been locked in a room for weeks. Her mother had threatened murder to break her. She had wept so long, the carriage was held outside the church for 20 minutes while her face composed itself. The man waiting at the altar had been told he was permitted to marry her only because she came with $2,500,000. The bride was Consuelo Vanderbilt. The cage was a palace, and it had 187 rooms. If you stay with me for this story, you will hear how that palace was built, who it consumed, and what one young woman did with the rest of her life to make sure she was not the last word in it. Subscribe, so you do not miss what comes next. Chapter 1. The Girl Who Was Sold for a Palace. She was 18 years old, 6 feet tall, in love with a man called Winthrop Rutherfurd, and she had no idea she had already been spent. She had been born in March 1877 on the 3rd floor of the Vanderbilt mansion at 659 Fifth Avenue in New York. Her father was William Kissam Vanderbilt. Her mother was Alva Erskine Smith. Her great-grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt, called the Commodore, had built the family fortune from a small ferry in New York Harbor and left $105 million on his deathbed, a sum greater than the United States Treasury held at the time. By the year of her wedding, the Vanderbilt fortune was approaching $200 million across the cousins. Her own father held about $55 million of that money. He was one of the 4 richest men in the country. In the house on Fifth Avenue, the cradle was rocked beneath a ceiling painted with cherubs. The nursery was on the 3rd floor, the schoolroom on the 4th, the ballroom on the 2nd. By the age of 3, she could speak 2 languages. By the age of 6, she could speak 4. By the age of 15, she stood 5 feet 10 inches tall in stockinged feet and was still growing. Her mother decided that her posture was wrong. For 2 hours each day, in the schoolroom on Fifth Avenue, Consuelo wore a steel rod harness. The rod ran the length of her spine. A circle of leather held her chin upright. Her hands were tied to a belt at her waist. In this harness, she translated Tacitus, learned the dates of the French kings, memorized the geography of the Russian Empire, and tried not to weep. Her mother sat in a chair across the room and watched. Slouching, Alva believed, was the mark of a vulgar mind. The plan, formed by Alva and never spoken aloud to the child, was an old plan dressed in new money. The Vanderbilts had built railroads, but the Astors and the Schermerhorns had built New York society, and they would not invite the Vanderbilts to dine. Alva had tried for 10 years to break their door open. Her great house on Fifth Avenue, the Petit Chateau, was the most expensive private dwelling in America. It did not work. Her costume ball of 1883, at which she had appeared as a Venetian princess on a marble staircase, had finally forced an Astor invitation. It did not last. The doors closed again. Alva turned her ambition elsewhere. She would not be admitted into New York society. Very well. She would go above it. By the spring of 1894, Alva had a copy of the Almanach de Gotha open on her writing desk. The Gotha is the directory of the royal and noble families of Europe. She underlined the names of the dukedoms. She wrote letters to friends in London. She paid careful attention to the listings of estimated annual incomes in the publication called Titled Americans, which sat next to the Gotha on her desk. She was looking for a man old enough to take a wife, young enough to need one, of a title old enough to silence the Astors, and of a family poor enough to need her daughter's money. Consuelo, who had heard nothing of this, was meanwhile reading the letters of Winthrop Rutherfurd. Rutherfurd was a tall young lawyer of 30, of an old American family of the Hudson Valley, with grey eyes and quiet manners. They had met at a dinner in 1893. They had ridden together in Central Park. By the summer of 1894, in the careful language of the period, they had an understanding. They were not engaged, but they understood that they would be. The understanding ended on a morning in 1895, when Alva opened her daughter's writing desk and read what she found there. She did not speak of the letters to Consuelo. She spoke instead to her husband, William Kissam Vanderbilt. She told him that the family was going to Europe for the summer. Consuelo was going to be presented at court. There would be a marriage. She had already chosen the man. She had not, she said, yet decided whether to tell her daughter. The man Alva had chosen was 9 months younger than Consuelo had been at her first communion. He was 24. He lived in a palace of 187 rooms. He could not afford to keep it open. His mother, who had also been an American heiress, had instructed him precisely what to look for in a wife. His name was Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill. His title was the 9th Duke of Marlborough. His estate was bankrupt. It is the strangest fact about the 1890s that two people who would never meet under their own steam, who lived 3,000 miles apart, who had no common language of feeling, could be measured up against each other in 2 account books on 2 writing desks, one in New York and one in Oxfordshire, and the books would close. A daughter, when a mother sees a transaction, is no longer a daughter. She is a unit of payment. Alva, in those weeks of the spring of 1895, was not yet a monster. She was a woman who believed, with absolute conviction, that she was acting in her child's best interest. She was a woman who would, in time, become a leading suffragette in America and stand on platforms for the freedom of other women. The question that hangs over the rest of this story is how the same woman could be both these things. The answer, when it comes, will be paid for in years of one human life. Chapter 2. The Duke who could not pay his debts. 3,000 miles away, in the largest country house in England, a young man was being told that he must save the building or lose it forever. Blenheim Palace sits in 2,100 acres of parkland near Woodstock in Oxfordshire. It is the only non-royal, non-episcopal country house in England that is permitted to bear the title of palace. It was begun in 1705, after the first Duke of Marlborough, John Churchill, defeated the French at the Battle of Blenheim. Queen Anne and Parliament had granted him the land and a sum of money to build a memorial palace to the victory. The design was by Sir John Vanbrugh, the dramatist who had become an architect by accident. The clerk of works was Nicholas Hawksmoor. The first Duchess, Sarah Churchill, fought Vanbrugh from the beginning. She wanted a comfortable house. He gave her a Baroque temple. She wished, more than once, that the building had never been razed. She lived in it, nevertheless, until her death. The palace was built of warm, honey-coloured stone. It rose around a great court, 17 acres in extent. Its central block was flanked by 2 service courtyards, the kitchen court on the east and the stable court on the west. The great hall, just within the portico, climbed 67 feet to a painted ceiling on which the first Duke knelt before Britannia and held out a plan of his great battle. The saloon was lined with painted walls by Louis Laguerre, showing peoples of the 4 continents looking in at the Marlboroughs at dinner. The long library ran 183 feet along the west front and was one of the longest rooms in any English country house. The number of named rooms was 187. To build this monument cost £300,000 in the 18th century. To maintain it cost, by the 1890s, around £40,000 a year. The annual income from the estate's rents had, by 1895, fallen to under £30,000. The agricultural depression that had begun in the 1870s had collapsed grain prices and broken the rental incomes of every great house in England. The 8th Duke of Marlborough, Sonny's father, had spent 20 years selling the contents of the palace to keep the roof on. He had auctioned the Sunderland Library. He had sold paintings by Rubens, by Raphael, by Van Dyck. He had married, late in life, an American widow called Lily Hammersley, whose fortune had paid for the heating system and the roof repairs of his last decade. He had died in 1892. The estate had passed to his son, Sonny, at the age of 21. Within 3 years of his accession, Sonny was £300,000 in arrears on the running of the house. Sonny was 24 years old in the summer of 1895. He had been raised at Blenheim. He had been educated at Winchester and at Trinity College, Cambridge. He spoke fluent French, fluent Italian, and excellent German. He understood the precise condition of the lead on the roof, the precise depth of the foundations, the precise number of state portraits that had been sold by his father and would need to be bought back. He had been told, since the age of 14, that the question of his marriage was not a question for him, but for the estate. He was, by every account, in love with another woman. The accounts differ on her name. The most credible identify her as Muriel Wilson, the daughter of a Hull shipowner, an English girl of good family and modest fortune. He had courted her. He had asked his mother. His mother had refused. His uncles had refused. The estate could not be saved by Muriel Wilson's £200,000. The estate required a transatlantic transfusion. Lily had told him, in the language of his own mother, that he was to find an American. In the spring of 1895, he had crossed the Atlantic. He had stayed in Newport. He had been introduced to a number of young women of marriageable fortune. He had been particularly impressed by none of them. He had returned to England. Then, in May, a letter had reached him from Alva Vanderbilt. The letter mentioned her daughter Consuelo. It mentioned a dowry of $2,500,000. It mentioned a willingness to discuss the matter in London during the summer season. The Duke replied within the week. He would be in London in June. He had not yet met her face to face. He had seen her in a photograph in a society paper. He had remarked, to a friend at his club, that she had a long neck. He had said nothing else about her. He had then gone to his estate office and worked out the figures. $2.5 million in railway shares producing $100,000 a year, plus a cash lump sum to clear the immediate debts. The palace could be saved. The roof could be relaid. The staterooms could be restored. The lead could be replaced. The Sunderland Library, the Rubens paintings, the Van Dyck portraits could be repurchased from auction. The gardens could be remade. A landscape architect called Achille Duchesne could be brought from Paris to lay out a great Italian garden and the water terraces along the river. The triumphal arch could be cleaned. The column of victory could be restored. 200 years after the first Duke's triumph, the building could once more look as the first Duchess had hated to see it look. The price was a marriage to a girl he had never met, 3,000 miles away, who already loved another man. He did not flinch from the price. He had been raised in the building. He believed, with a conviction his class had cultivated for centuries, that the building was greater than the people who lived in it. The roof, in his moral order, came before the woman who slept under it. He sent his letter of acceptance to Mrs. Vanderbilt in May. He sailed for New York in June. Chapter 3. The Locked Room at Marble House. When Consuelo refused, her mother turned the key and waited. Marble House at Newport, Rhode Island, was Alva's summer cottage. It had been built between 1888 and 1892 to a design by Richard Morris Hunt. It cost $11 million, of which $7 million was spent on marble alone. The dining room walls were lined with pink Numidian marble. The ballroom was lined with gold. The grounds ran down to the sea. The house had been a 40th birthday gift from William Kissam Vanderbilt to his wife. It was the largest private residence on the island. In the summer of 1895, Consuelo arrived at Marble House from New York with her mother and her brothers. She was told that she would be presented at the Court of St. James the following spring. She was told that the family was going to England for the summer season. She was told nothing of the Duke of Marlborough. Then, on a morning in early August, Alva told her. She was to marry the 9th Duke of Marlborough. The arrangement was settled. The settlement was being drawn up. The wedding would take place in New York in November. The Duke would arrive in September to be presented to the family. The wedding gown had already been ordered from Paris. Consuelo did not speak for some moments. Then she said that she was engaged to Winthrop Rutherfurd. She said that she would marry no one else. She said that she would, if necessary, run away. Alva closed the door of the upstairs sitting room. She locked it from the inside. She put the key into the pocket of her dress. She told her daughter that there would be no running away. She told her that Rutherfurd would be informed, with a courtesy he did not deserve, that the engagement was at an end. She told her daughter that the marriage to the Duke of Marlborough would proceed. Consuelo said that she would not marry the Duke. Alva said that, if Consuelo refused, she had a pistol in her room, and she would shoot Mr. Rutherfurd. She would arrange the matter so that no one would know. She would have Mr. Rutherfurd killed. The threat was specific. It was named. It came from a woman who had, in the same year, dragged the most powerful family in America through a divorce, and won. Consuelo, 18 years old, locked in an upstairs room of her mother's house in a state of complete isolation, believed her. She had reason to believe her. She had seen her mother destroy lesser obstacles. She had seen her mother destroy her father's mistress. She had seen her mother dismiss servants in tears for the smallest infraction. She believed her. For 4 weeks of August and September, Consuelo was kept under guard at Marble House. Her letters were read before they left the house. Her visitors were screened. Her brothers were sent to stay with friends. Her father was kept in New York. Rutherfurd, in the city, sent letters that were intercepted at the door and burned. He did not know what was happening. He believed she had broken with him. By the time he learned the truth, she had been forced to write him a letter saying that the engagement was at an end. The letter was dictated by Alva, sentence by sentence, while Consuelo wrote it down. Consuelo signed it. Alva sent it. In late September, Alva opened the door. She told her daughter that there had been a wise decision. She brought in the dressmaker. The dressmaker measured Consuelo for the wedding gown. The bride wore Worth of Paris in white satin embroidered with orange blossom. The veil was 40 feet long. The train was 20 feet. The fittings took 3 weeks. Consuelo wept during every fitting. The dressmaker did not look up. He had been paid to fit a gown, not to ask questions. In early October, the Duke arrived in New York. He was introduced to Consuelo at a dinner at the Vanderbilt house on Fifth Avenue. He spoke to her in French. He found her charming. He did not notice that she did not look at him. He returned to his hotel and wrote a letter to his solicitor confirming the figures. The wedding day was the 6th of November, 1895. The wedding took place at St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue at 12 noon. The Bishop of Long Island officiated. The choir of 50 boys was paid to come up from Trinity Church on Wall Street. 25,000 people stood outside the church in the rain. The carriage carrying the bride from the Vanderbilt house arrived at the church at 20 minutes past 12. It did not stop. It went on, slowly, around the block. The bride was unable to leave the carriage. She could not stop crying. The face under the veil was a face she could not present. For 20 minutes the carriage moved at a walking pace. The press, on the steps of the church, did not know what had happened. The Duke, at the altar, did not know. The bishop did not know. The mother, in the front pew, knew. When the carriage stopped at last in front of the church, Alva was outside it. She put her face close to the window. She did not say what she said. The carriage door opened. Consuelo stepped down. Her veil covered her face. The procession formed. The choir began the entrance hymn. The bride walked down the aisle of St. Thomas Church on her father's arm, with red rims around her eyes that no one could see. The Duke turned at the altar. He took her hand. The marriage was made. That evening, on a special train of the New York Central Railway, given to the couple as a wedding gift by William Kissam Vanderbilt, Consuelo Vanderbilt, now Duchess of Marlborough, sat alone in a compartment lined with green velvet, and looked out of the window at the New England woods and prayed for the train to crash. Chapter 4. The honeymoon that killed the marriage. He waited until the third night to tell her why he had married her. The honeymoon was a journey of state. They sailed from New York to Le Havre on a Canada. They went up to Paris. They were received at the Hotel Bristol. The Duchess of Marlborough, 24 hours into her marriage, was photographed in the Rue de la Paix with her husband. Consuelo wore Paris hats. She wore Paris gowns. She smiled when she was told to smile. On the train south from Paris, on the third evening of the marriage, the Duke spoke to her in private for the first time without ceremony. He sat across from her in the compartment. He said that he wished her to understand certain facts. He said that he was a man who took his duty seriously. He said that he had given up the woman he loved in order to take her. He said that the woman he had given up was an Englishwoman of impeccable family. He said that he had taken Consuelo because the palace required $2,500,000. He said that he wished her to understand that he had done what was necessary and that he expected her to do the same. Consuelo, who was 18 years old, who had been raised to do what was necessary, who had been schooled in obedience for 3 months in a locked room at Newport, listened to the Duke. She did not weep. She had wept already. She did not answer. There was no answer to make. She looked out of the window of the train at the dark forests of France. After some minutes, the Duke went to the dining carriage. Consuelo remained in the compartment. The honeymoon continued for 6 weeks. They visited Rome. They were received at the Vatican by Pope Leo XIII, who blessed the marriage and gave them rosaries. They visited Naples. They visited Florence. They visited Venice. Consuelo learned to write the letters that a duchess wrote. She learned to take precedence at table. She learned not to be the first to speak. She wrote to her mother in New York. She did not say what had been said on the train. She would not say so for 30 years. In the second week of January, 1896, they crossed the Channel and arrived in London. They went up to Oxford the following day. They reached Blenheim by carriage at dusk in the rain on a January evening. The gates opened. The horses moved at a walking pace along the gravel drive. The lake stretched out under the rain. The column of Victory rose against the grey sky. The triumphal arch came up. They passed beneath it. The great court opened before them. The palace, all 187 rooms of it, lay across the far end of the court, lit by 100 windows. The household had been assembled on the steps to greet the new duchess. 40 indoor servants, the steward at their head, the housekeeper beside him, the butler in his black coat, 2 footmen at each carriage door, the chef from Paris in his white linen, looking embarrassed, the lines of housemaids in starched aprons, the under-butler, the valet, the lady's maid, the estate agent. 200 outdoor servants ranged on the lawn in the rain, the whole village of Woodstock on the road outside the gate, in the rain, in the dusk. The Duke stepped down. He took her hand. He walked her up the steps. The steward presented the household. Each member was named, each was acknowledged. Consuelo, in the gown she had been wearing on the train, with her travelling cape over her shoulders, walked from one to another. She said the words she had been taught. The lady's maid stepped forward. Consuelo, who had not been raised to think of servants as invisible, looked her in the eye. The Duchess's apartments were on the first floor of the east front, overlooking the formal gardens and the lake. The bedroom was 30 feet square. The sitting room was the same. The dressing room had a bath of solid marble. The Duke's apartments lay on the south front, separated from hers by long corridors and 4 doors. There was no connecting door. That night, the first night under the roof, Consuelo lay in the great bed and listened to the silence. There were no sounds. The palace at midnight did not creak. The walls were too thick. The corridors were too long. The other people in the building were too far away. She had been told, at dinner, that the chef had spent the morning preparing the meal she had not eaten. She had been told that the household had spent 2 weeks preparing her rooms. She had been told that the village had stood 3 hours in the rain to see her arrive. She closed her eyes. She tried to sleep. In a small diary that she kept that year, in a hand that was steady and small and careful, she wrote the entry that the world would not see for 57 years. The entry is given in the glitter and the gold. It is 1 line. It says that there were nights at Blenheim, in those first months, in which she prayed to die. She did not die. She woke in the morning. The lady's maid came in. The fires were lit. The trays were brought. The hot water was poured. The bath was drawn. The clothes were laid out. The Duchess of Marlborough rose, was dressed, was given coffee, and went downstairs to the dining room. The Duke was already at the table. He stood when she entered. He did not look at her. He sat down again. The footman poured. The honeymoon was over. The marriage had begun. There was no exit. There were no friends in the building. The mother who had bought her was 3,000 miles away. The man she had loved was lost. The next 24 years lay before her. She picked up her coffee cup. Her hand did not shake. Chapter 5. The Palace that ate its mistress. There were 187 rooms, and she could not hear her own footsteps in any of them. The first week of her life at Blenheim Palace, Consuelo Vanderbilt walked the building from end to end. She walked through the great hall, with its painted ceiling 67 feet above her. She walked the length of the long library, 183 feet. She walked through the enfilade of staterooms on the south front, the bow window room, the green drawing room, the red drawing room, the green writing room. She walked through the state bedroom in which Queen Anne had slept on her 2 visits to the palace. She walked through the chapel. She walked through the kitchens. She walked through the laundries. She walked through the dairy. She walked through the brewhouse. She walked through the stable courtyard. She walked through the kitchen courtyard. She counted, in those first days, 40 rooms that were closed. Their doors were locked. Their windows were shuttered. Their furniture was under dust sheets. The Duke explained that they were not in use. She counted 40 more rooms that were inhabited. The rest were corridors and stairs and antechambers and dressing rooms. She counted, between her own bedroom and her husband's bedroom, 47 doors that one would need to pass through to reach him. There was no need to pass through them. After the first month at Blenheim, she did not enter the Duke's apartments. After the first 3 months, he did not enter hers. They met for meals. They met for the household prayers in the chapel on Sunday morning. They met for the public functions of the house. They did not meet otherwise. The household calendar was rigid. The Duke rose at 7. He read his estate correspondence in his study from 7:30 to 9. He breakfasted at 9 in the bow window room with the Duchess and any guests in residence. At 10, he met the estate agent in the office. At 12, he received callers. At 1, he lunched. From 2 to 4, he wrote letters. At 4, he took tea, generally in the green drawing room. From 5 to 7, he rode in the park or shot in the woods. At 7, he dressed for dinner. At 8, he dined. After dinner, the men sat in the smoking room. The women sat in the red drawing room. The party reconvened in the music room for an hour. The Duke retired to bed at 11. Consuelo's day was constructed around his. She rose at 8. She breakfasted at 9. She received the housekeeper at 10 in her sitting room and went through the menus for the day. She received the steward at 11 and went through the household accounts. She lunched at 1. She drove out in the carriage at 3. She visited tenants on the estate. She returned by 5. She wrote letters until 7. She dressed for dinner. She dined at 8. The Duke was 27 feet away across the dining table. The dining table itself was 40 feet long. When only the Duke and Duchess were present, which was most evenings in the early years, they sat at the two ends. The footmen carried plates the length of the table. Conversation was not possible at normal volume. To speak, one had to raise one's voice. To raise one's voice was to speak in the hearing of the footman, the butler, the under-butler, and the steward, who stood behind the chairs. Conversation was therefore not held. The Duke read a book at his end of the table. The Duchess looked at the wall. The cold, Consuelo wrote in her memoir, was the second great shock. Blenheim had been built without consideration for warmth. The great hall was 67 feet to the ceiling. The fireplaces were 16 feet wide. They drew the heat up the chimneys faster than they could put it into the room. The corridors were stone-flagged. The staterooms had marble floors. There were no carpets in the long library, because the first Duchess had wanted none. The temperature in the corridors, in January, was not above 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The temperature in the Duchess's sitting room, with a fire roaring in the grate, was perhaps 55. Consuelo wore 3 layers of wool indoors. She wore a fur stole at dinner. She wrote to her mother in New York and described the cold. Alva wrote back and told her that she would grow used to it. The hidden infrastructure of the palace, the 40 indoor servants and the 200 outdoor servants, ran on rails Consuelo had never imagined. The housemaid rose at 4:30 in the morning. She lit the fires in the staterooms before 5. She emptied the grates of the previous evening. She blacked the grates. She laid new fires. She dusted the furniture. She replaced the candles. She drew back the curtains. She was finished with the staterooms by 8, in order that the family might come downstairs. She then began on the bedrooms. She finished the bedrooms by 1. She had her own meal at 1:30 in the servants' hall. She had the afternoon, in theory, for mending. She was back on duty at 5 to dress the rooms for the evening. She helped the lady's maid to dress the Duchess. She returned to her own quarters at midnight. Her wages were £18 a year. She had 1 day off a month. Consuelo learned the names of the housemaids. She visited the sick ones in their rooms under the eaves of the attic. She gave them small gifts. She raised the wages of the lowest ranks against the advice of the steward and against the open opposition of the Duke. She instituted a rule that the housemaids should not be required to begin work before 5. Her mother-in-law, the Dowager Duchess Lily, who was American by birth and ought to have understood, told Consuelo that she was being absurd. Servants did not require sympathy. They required management. The English country house, the Dowager said, ran on a system. The Duchess of Marlborough was not paid to disturb it. Within the palace, Consuelo had 3 allies and 3 only. The first was Annette, her French lady's maid, who had come with her from Paris. The second was Mrs. Hood, the housekeeper, an Englishwoman of 50 who had served 3 duchesses and recognised in the new young one the same loneliness she had seen twice before. The third was an elderly cocker spaniel called Cuthbert, who had been a wedding gift from her father and who slept on her bed every night for the next 11 years. The dinners and weekend parties were the great public displays. King Edward, then still Prince of Wales, came to Blenheim in 1901. The future King George V came. The Marquess of Salisbury came. The Marquess of Lansdowne came. The political class of late Victorian and early Edwardian England filed through the Great Hall. The footmen wore powdered wigs. The chef from Paris worked a 14-course dinner. The long library was lit by 200 candles. The Duchess stood at her end of the receiving line in white satin and the Marlborough tiara. She did not falter. She did not weep. She did not speak above a murmur. She did not cease, in any moment, to perform. What no one in the receiving line saw was that she had, by the end of her first year in residence, lost over a stone in weight. Her wedding rings, which had fit perfectly on the day of the marriage, slipped from her fingers. The lady's maid had a jeweller come from London and reduce them. The new size was the size at which they would stay for the rest of her life. Chapter 6. The Heir and the Spare. He needed 2 sons, and once he had them, he was finished with her. The first child, named John Albert Edward William Spencer Churchill, and known throughout his life as Bert, was born at Spencer House in London on the 18th of September, 1897. He was the heir to the Dukedom of Marlborough. He was 22 months old when his brother followed. Lord Ivor Charles Spencer Churchill was born at Blenheim on the 14th of October, 1898. He was the spare. The 2 sons were the central object of the marriage. The settlement of 1895 had not stated this in writing. It had not needed to. The understanding had been complete from the moment the dowry had been negotiated. The palace required an heir of the Vanderbilt money. The Marlborough title required a continuation. The Duchess was the means. The nurseries were on the 3rd floor of the east front. They were 3 rooms in line, a day nursery, a night nursery, and a bathroom. They had been the nurseries of the Marlborough children for 200 years. They were staffed by a head nurse, an under nurse, a nursery maid, and a young woman whose only task was to launder the children's clothes by hand. The nursery clock had been wound every morning since the 18th century. The night nurse went on duty at 7 in the evening and went off at 7 in the morning. The day nurse arrived at 7. The children were dressed by 8, fed at 8:30, and brought downstairs to be shown to their parents in the breakfast room at 9. In the breakfast room, the head nurse handed the children to their mother. Their mother kissed them on the forehead. Their father looked at them. He inquired after their health. He nodded. The head nurse took them back. The children were returned to the 3rd floor. The interview lasted, by the household clock, 4 minutes. This was the daily ritual of Consuelo's motherhood. Once a day, for 4 minutes, in the morning. Twice on Sundays. On their birthdays, for half an hour, in the nursery. The English country house tradition of the period had no other arrangement to offer. The children belonged to the nurses until the age of 7, to the tutors until the age of 13, and to school after that. The mother, in this system, was an emblem of the lineage. She was not in any practical sense a parent. Consuelo refused, as she had refused with the housemaids to behave as the system required. She went up to the nursery in the afternoons. She read to her children. She held them in her arms. She bathed them on one occasion with her own hands. The head nurse complained to the Duke. The Duke summoned his wife to his study. He told her that he had been informed of behaviour beneath the dignity of her position. He told her that the head nurse had been employed because the head nurse knew her work. He told her that the children would suffer from confusion if their mother behaved as a nurse. He told her, with the precision he reserved for his most considered observations, that she should remember that she was not in America. She did not stop going up to the nursery. She did, however, learn to time her visits so that the head nurse was elsewhere. She learned to enter the nursery only after the children had been put to bed for the afternoon nap. She learned to sit beside the cot and read to her sons in a low voice for an hour, and to leave before the head nurse returned. The head nurse never spoke of the visits. The Duke did not learn of them. Bert, at the age of 3, asked his mother who was the man who came to see them in the mornings. Consuelo told him. Bert nodded. He did not ask again. The two boys were close in age and close in temperament. They grew tall, like their mother, and thin, like their father. They spoke French and English from the cradle. They were taught to ride at 4, to shoot at 8, to fish at 9. They were taken to London for the season. They were taken to Newport in the summers of 1904 and 1906 to visit their American grandparents. They were sent away to school at Eton at the age of 12. Consuelo's hand in their upbringing remained, by the standards of the English aristocracy, intrusive. She read to them. She wrote them letters every week. She visited them at Eton more often than was customary. She invited their friends home for the holidays. She made the nurseries a place of warmth in a building that was cold everywhere else. The Duke, in the period after the birth of the spare, withdrew from the marriage entirely. The separate apartments became the separate lives. He left the palace for weeks at a time to shoot in Scotland, to attend court in London, to take the waters at Marienbad, to travel in Italy. The Duchess remained at Blenheim. The household ran on her management. The estate accounts crossed her desk. The menus were her responsibility. The state visits were her ceremony. She was alone for weeks together in a building of 187 rooms. In the winter of 1901, she fell ill with a chill that became pneumonia. She lay in her bed for 3 weeks. She nearly died. The Duke was in London. He was informed by telegram. He did not come. He sent a letter of inquiry. The doctor wrote to him in plain language that the Duchess was in danger. The Duke wrote back, asking for further reports. He did not arrive at Blenheim until 10 days after the crisis. By then she had recovered. He inquired after her health. He stayed 2 days. He returned to London. The marriage, by the spring of 1902, had become an arrangement between two people who lived in the same building and did not speak. The household preserved appearances. The world preserved appearances. The first Duchess of Marlborough, 2 centuries before, had quarrelled bitterly with her husband and refused to speak to him for years. The tradition was an old one. Consuelo, however, was not the first Duchess. She was a woman of the late 19th century. She had been raised to read. She had been raised to think. She had been raised, in spite of everything her mother had done, to believe that her life was her own. She began, in the winter of 1902, to consider what her life might be if she stopped considering the palace as the centre of it. The thought was small at first. It came to her in the nursery, with her younger son on her lap. She had fulfilled, by the autumn of 1898, the entire purpose of her marriage. She had given the dukedom an heir and a spare. The contract had been performed. The palace had been saved. The Duke had no further use for her. The world, in any meaningful sense, did not require her to remain. She did not say this thought aloud. She did not write it in any letter. But from that moment, slowly, she began to build a life that was not Blenheim. Chapter 7. The Other Woman Inside the Walls. Her name was Gladys, and she had once sat at Consuelo's table as a friend. Gladys Marie Deacon was born in Paris in 1881, the daughter of an American couple of broken fortune and noisy temperament. Her father, Edward Parker Deacon, was a Bostonian whose family had made and lost money in the China trade. Her mother, Florence Baldwin Deacon, was an heiress of moderate fortune whose marriage to Mr. Deacon had ended in a celebrated divorce in 1892, in the course of which Mr. Deacon had shot and killed his wife's lover in a hotel room in Cannes. The Deacon scandal had filled the European papers for a season. The children, 4 daughters, had been raised in Paris under their mother's irregular supervision. They had grown up beautiful, multilingual, and cynical. Gladys was the most striking of the 4 sisters. She had blue eyes set wide apart, fair hair, classical features, and a knowledge of literature and philosophy that astonished the men who met her. She had been educated after a fashion in convents in Belgium and France. She had read Plato in Greek by the age of 16. She had been admired by Auguste Rodin, who carved her a marble bust. She had been admired by Bernard Berenson, who took her on tours of Italian paintings. She had been admired by Marcel Proust, who wrote a sentence about her in a letter and crossed it out. She had first appeared at Blenheim in 1901, at the age of 20, on her own initiative. She had written to the Duke and asked to see the palace. The Duke had received her. The Duke had been struck. He had invited her to stay. Consuelo, who knew nothing of the letter, had received Gladys as her own guest. They had become friends. Consuelo had introduced Gladys to her brothers in New York. Gladys had visited Marble House. The friendship had appeared, to outsiders, complete. It had not been complete. By 1902, the Duke and Gladys had begun an affair. It was conducted with discretion. It was conducted at first in the houses of Gladys's friends in Paris and London. Consuelo, who learned of it by means she did not record, did not confront her husband. She did not confront Gladys. She withdrew her hospitality. She declined to receive Gladys at Blenheim. The Duke was furious. He insisted on Gladys's presence at every house party. Consuelo, in the late summer of 1902, retreated to London for the season. The bicentenary celebrations of the first Duke's accession to the dukedom were held at Blenheim in the August of 1904. They were the most lavish public events of the marriage. King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra arrived on the Friday afternoon. They were received by the Duke and Duchess on the steps of the Great Court. The Duchess wore a gown of white satin embroidered with golden ears of wheat to symbolize the harvest of peace that the first Duke's victory had brought. She wore the Marlborough tiara. She wore the family pearls in 3 strands. She was 27 years old. 500 guests dined in the long library that night. The footmen wore the 18th century livery, recovered from the storerooms and brushed for the occasion. The chef had brought up an additional 8 men from Paris and Vienna to manage the kitchen. 12 courses were served. 4 wines were served. The toast to the king was given by the Duke. The Queen replied. The orchestra in the gallery played the music of Handel. The portraits of the first Duke and the first Duchess looked down from the walls. Consuelo presided at her end of the table. She did not falter. She was the Duchess of Marlborough at the height of her public power. The room was hers. The palace was hers. The country, for that one evening, was watching her. She made the small movements of the head, the inclinations of the body, the murmured words that her position required. She did not look at the chair 7 places down on the Duke's side of the table. In that chair, in white silk and diamonds, sat Gladys Deacon. The Duke had insisted. The Duke had won. The bicentenary was the last great public event of the marriage. It was also the moment at which Consuelo decided. After the King and Queen departed on the Monday morning, she went up to her sitting room. She locked the door. She wrote a letter to her father in New York. She did not send it. She wrote a letter to her mother. She did not send it. She wrote a third letter to Sir George Lewis, the most famous solicitor in London, who handled the marital affairs of the wealthy. She sent that one. The separation took 2 years to arrange. There was no divorce. The Edwardian aristocracy did not divorce. There was a deed of separation, drawn up by Sir George and the Duke's solicitors. There was an allowance for the Duchess. There was an arrangement about the children. The boys would remain in their father's custody during the school terms, with their mother during the long vacations. The Duchess would live in London, at Sunderland House on Curzon Street, which had been built for her in 1899 by her father as a wedding present. The Duke would live at Blenheim. They would meet only as required by the public engagements of the family. The deed was signed in October 1906. Consuelo packed her trunks. She took her dogs, her books, her writing desk, and her jewels. She took with her the Sargent portrait of herself and her sons, which had been painted in 1905, and which she would later move from Sunderland House to her Paris home. She left behind 187 rooms. She did not return to Blenheim Palace as the resident Duchess. She returned only as a visitor, and rarely. The cage had opened. The bird was 30 years old. It had been inside for 11 years. It had 2 sons it loved. It had a marriage it had never wanted. It had nothing else. The rest, she now understood, she would have to build. Chapter 8. The London House and the Other Life. She had begun, very quietly, to refuse to come home. Sunderland House at the corner of Curzon Street and Hertford Street in Mayfair was a wedding gift from William Kissam Vanderbilt to his daughter in 1899. It had cost over £100,000 to build. It was designed in the French 18th century style by the architect Reginald Blomfield. It had a grand staircase of white marble. It had a ballroom panelled in painted silk. It had a dining room that could seat 60. It had bedrooms enough for 30 servants in the attics. It was, by the standards of a London townhouse, an extraordinary building. By the standards of Blenheim Palace, it was a cottage. Consuelo loved it. From the first weeks after her arrival in October 1906, she made it the centre of a life entirely different from the one she had led at Blenheim. She rose at 9. She breakfasted alone, with a newspaper, in the morning room. She received her secretary at 10 and dealt with her correspondence. She received her solicitor on Wednesdays. She received her dressmaker once a month. She lunched with friends, often at home, sometimes in restaurants. Restaurants were a new fashion of the period. The Duchess of Marlborough was photographed dining at the Ritz. She walked in Hyde Park in the afternoons. She visited her charity work in the East End most days of the week. The charity work was the centre of her new life. She had begun it during the years at Blenheim, in a small way, as her one permitted outlet. It became, after 1906, her vocation. She established the Sunderland House Hostel for working women near Charing Cross Station. It provided beds and meals for single working women in respectable lodgings at a price the women could afford. In a part of London where the alternative for a single woman was a doss house or the streets. The hostel held 120 beds. It was always full. Consuelo paid for its construction, its staff wages, and its running costs from her own allowance. She visited it twice a week. She involved herself with the diocesan funds of the Bishop of London. The diocese ran clinics for infants in Bethnal Green, in Whitechapel, in Bow, and in Poplar. She gave the money for 2 new clinics. She sat on the committee. She visited the clinics. She held the infants in her own arms. The newspapers, when they noticed, treated the matter as the eccentricity of a great lady. Consuelo did not care what the newspapers said. She had stopped caring some years before. She became, in those years, a patron of working women's institutes, of widows' societies, of orphanages, of the Mary Curzon Society for the Welfare of Indian Women. She gave money. She gave time. She gave her name to letters in the Times. Her name carried weight. The title of Duchess of Marlborough, which had been the instrument of her captivity, became, in her hands, an instrument of leverage. She used it ruthlessly. She had earned it. She would spend it. In the spring of 1907, she went down to the East End for the first time. Her secretary, who was alarmed, accompanied her. She visited a tenement in Whitechapel in which a widowed mother of 5 children lived in a single room. The mother worked as a button-maker. She was paid by the gross. She earned, when the work was steady, 12 shillings a week. The room was 12 feet by 10. 5 children slept in one bed. The mother slept in a chair. The kitchen was a coal grate in the corner. The lavatory was 3 flights down in the yard, shared with 4 other families. Consuelo went home to Sunderland House. She sat in her sitting room and wept. She had wept, in her life, only twice before in public. She had wept on the morning of her wedding. She had wept in the carriage at St. Thomas. She had not wept since. The tears that came on the evening of the East End visit were different in quality. They were not the tears of a woman who had been wronged. They were the tears of a woman who had learned something. The learning was that the wrong done to her had been one wrong among very many, and that hers, on the scale of the wrongs that were done in the world, had been smaller than she had thought. From that evening, she did not stop. She did not stop for the rest of her life. The wealth that her mother had bought her marriage with, the wealth that had built Blenheim back up, the wealth that had given her the gowns and the tiaras and the houses, became, in her hands, a source of redistribution. She gave away, in the period from 1907 to 1914, over £200,000 of her own money. She gave for clinics. She gave for hostels. She gave for milk for infants. She gave for fuel for the elderly in the winter of 1909. She gave anonymously, as far as she could. She allowed her name to be used only when it would draw more money from others. She met the suffragettes. She had been told, by her solicitors, by her brothers, by her old American friends, that the suffragette cause was vulgar. She was, by the standards of her class, a woman of position. She should keep clear. She did not keep clear. She met Mrs. Pankhurst at a luncheon at the home of a Liberal MP in 1909. She sat next to her. They talked about the East End clinics. They talked about working women. They talked about the vote. Consuelo, after that luncheon, gave the Women's Social and Political Union £1,000. She did not march. She did not break windows. She did not chain herself to railings. But she gave, and she put her name to letters in the Times. The letters were widely read. Her mother, in New York, was meanwhile becoming the leading suffragette in America. Alva, in the years after her daughter's wedding, had transformed. She had remarried. Her second husband, Oliver Belmont, had been an early ally of the cause. He had died in 1908. Alva, in her widowhood, had become a militant. She had given a fortune to the National Woman's Party. She had funded the headquarters in Washington. She had, in 1915, sat in a parade in white with 200 women in white in the streets of New York. The mother and the daughter, who had not spoken with affection since the morning of the wedding, began, very slowly, to write to one another. The letters were polite at first. The letters were practical. They concerned the children. They concerned a sister-in-law. Then, in 1912, Alva sent a letter that was not practical. The letter said, in writing for the first time, that she was sorry. The letter said that she had been wrong. The letter said that she had broken her daughter. The letter said that she would, if her daughter would permit her, attempt, in the time remaining, to do what she could to make amends. Consuelo read the letter in her sitting room at Sunderland House. She put it down. She did not reply at once. She waited a fortnight. Then she wrote back. The letter she wrote has not survived. The letters that followed it have. The relationship that came back, slowly, in the years between 1912 and Alva's death in 1933, was the great surprise of Consuelo's later life. The mother who had sold her in the long evening of her own life became the mother who had not. They reached, at the end, something like peace. But that peace was years away. In the autumn of 1914, Consuelo's other life was not yet finished. War was about to come down on Europe. The world she had escaped from at Blenheim was about to dissolve, and the title she had been given against her will was, in the coming years, to become the most useful tool she had ever been handed. Chapter 9. The War, the Vote, and the Council Bench. The First World War took her servants and gave her a country. In August 1914, the gardeners and stable hands and footmen of Blenheim went to war. So did the gardeners of Sunderland House. So did the boys of the East End Hostel. So did Consuelo's son Bert, the 17th Earl of Sunderland, who had finished at Eton the previous summer and went directly into the Royal Horse Guards. So did the husbands and sons of the women in the clinics. So did, by October, 500,000 men. Sunderland House at the corner of Curzon Street was converted within a fortnight into a hospital for officers. Consuelo gave the building over. She moved into a flat at the back. The ballroom became a ward. The dining room became a ward. The morning room became an operating theatre. She raised the money. She paid the matron. She paid for the nurses who were trained at St. Thomas's Hospital and at Guy's. She organised the laundry, the kitchens, the supply chain. She visited the wards every day. She wrote letters home for the men who could not write. She read aloud to the men who were blind. She held the hands of the men who were dying. She did this work, without interruption, for 4 years. By the armistice in November 1918, Sunderland House had treated over 3,000 wounded officers. 12 had died on the premises. The records, kept in Consuelo's own hand, list every name. The records survive in the archives of the Imperial War Museum. In the same period, Consuelo extended her East End work. She raised, in 1915, a fund for free milk for infants and children under 5. The fund supplied milk to over 2,000 children a day in Bethnal Green, Whitechapel, Poplar, and Bow throughout the war. She funded a clinic for women whose husbands were at the front. She organised, with the cooperation of the London County Council, a scheme for the distribution of coal to the elderly in the winter of 1916. She paid for ambulances. She paid for canteens at railway stations. She paid for the small comforts of nurses on the wards of the great hospitals. In 1917, she stood for election to the London County Council for the seat of North Southwark. She stood as a progressive, the Liberal grouping on the council. The campaign was conducted with the dignity her position required. She did not knock on doors. She did not give street corner speeches. She gave one public address at the Borough Hall in which she spoke for 35 minutes on the subject of housing reform. The hall was full. The newspapers reported the address. The Daily Telegraph said that the Duchess of Marlborough had spoken with a fluency and a command of detail that few professional politicians could rival. She won the seat. She was one of the first women to be elected to the council. She took her seat in the chamber of the County Hall on the Embankment in November 1917. She served on the Public Health Committee. She served on the Housing Committee. She served on the Education Committee. She did not miss a meeting for 3 years. The other councillors, mostly men, mostly Labour or Liberal, mostly working class or middle class, were initially baffled by her. They became, slowly, her allies. She had read the briefs. She understood the figures. She did not, in the chamber, condescend. She was, in the words of one Labour councillor, the most useful Tory the council had ever had. He said this as a compliment. The People's Budget of 1909, Lloyd George's introduction of new land taxes and increased death duties, had broken the back of the landed aristocracy. The war finished the work the budget had begun. The agricultural rents on which Blenheim depended had fallen further. The Duke at Blenheim was struggling. He had begun, by 1918, to sell what he could. He had sold paintings. He had sold the Sunderland library books, again. He had sold the gold plate. The palace was hemorrhaging money. The dowry of 1895 had been spent. The maintenance of the building required twice what it brought in. Sonny pressed his sons. He pressed his agents. He pressed, at last, his former wife. He sent her, through her solicitor, a request for further sums. Consuelo, who by then was supporting the hospital at Sunderland House, the East End clinics, the Milk Fund, and the LCC seat from her allowance, did not refuse on her own behalf. She refused on Alva's. She forwarded the request to her mother in New York. Alva refused with vehemence. The Duke's letters became plaintive. The Duke's letters became, in the language of his class, distasteful. Consuelo did not reply. By 1920, her allowance had been reduced by the Duke's lawyers in dispute over the original deed. She went to court. She won. The settlement was upheld. She was now, by English law, separated and entitled to her income. The legal foundation for divorce, however, did not yet exist for her case. The Matrimonial Causes Act of 1923 would later make divorce easier. In 1921, she was able to proceed only because the Duke, weary of the marriage and wishing to be free to marry Gladys Deacon, agreed not to contest. The divorce was granted in May 1921 on grounds of his adultery. The decree absolute came through in November. In Paris, the following spring, Consuelo accepted Jacques Balsan. She had known him for 15 years. He was a French aviation pioneer. He held the French altitude record for a hot air balloon. He had served with distinction in the Great War. He was older than her, kind, intelligent, modest, and devoted. He had loved her, in silence, since 1906. He had asked her to marry him in 1917. She had asked him to wait. She had not, until then, been free. They were married in a civil ceremony in Paris on the 4th of July, 1921. The witnesses were French. The Vanderbilts did not attend. The Churchills did not attend. The boys, who were now grown, sent their good wishes. The Duke, in Oxfordshire, made no public comment. He had what he wanted. He could now arrange the annulment that would let him marry Gladys. The annulment, however, would take 5 more years, and it would extract from Alva Vanderbilt the confession that no one in 1895 had imagined possible. Chapter 10. The Annulment and the Confession. In 1926, the Catholic Church decided that the marriage had never existed. The mechanism was technical. The Catholic Church does not grant divorces, it grants annulments. An annulment is a finding by an ecclesiastical court that a sacramental marriage was never validly contracted. There are several grounds on which an annulment may be granted. One of them is duress. A marriage contracted under threat, force, or grave fear is not a valid marriage in canon law. Sonny had converted to Roman Catholicism in 1927. The conversion is a curious episode. He had been raised in the Church of England. He had served, as a young duke, as the Lord Lieutenant of Oxfordshire under an established Protestant church. His wife-in-waiting, Gladys Deacon, had been raised in France and was a nominal Catholic. He had decided to enter the Catholic Church partly, his biographers think, from genuine religious conviction in his 50s, and partly, the biographers think more cynically, from the need to free himself for a second marriage that would be sacramentally valid in the church Gladys belonged to. The application to the Westminster Diocesan Tribunal was made in 1925, in advance of his conversion. The application stated that the original 1895 marriage to Consuelo Vanderbilt had been contracted under duress and was therefore not a valid marriage in the eyes of the Church. The application was submitted by the Duke's solicitors. The tribunal opened proceedings. Consuelo was asked to provide testimony. She did so in writing from her house in France. Her testimony was 9 pages long. It was, in legal language, the first complete account she had ever given of what had happened to her in 1895. She described the relationship with Winthrop Rutherfurd. She described the confinement at Marble House. She described the letters that had been intercepted and the threats that had been made. She described her mother's pistol. She described the carriage that had been kept waiting 20 minutes outside St. Thomas Church. She described the night on the train when the Duke had told her why he had married her. She signed the testimony with her own hand. She had it witnessed by a notary in Paris. She sent it to Westminster. Alva was asked to provide testimony. Alva was now 73 years old. She was living in New York. She was the patron of the National Woman's Party. She was a leading suffragette. Her own life had become, in the years since the wedding, a long campaign for the autonomy of women. The request from the Catholic Tribunal arrived at her house in February 1926. She replied within a week. She would testify. She would tell the tribunal the whole truth. Alva's testimony, delivered in writing through her solicitor in New York and witnessed by an American notary, ran to 11 pages. It is the document on which the annulment hung. In it, Alva confessed that she had locked her daughter in a room at Marble House for 4 weeks in the summer of 1895. She confessed that she had threatened to kill Winthrop Rutherfurd. She confessed that she had dictated the letter of dismissal to Rutherfurd which Consuelo had signed. She confessed that she had refused to permit her daughter to attend the wedding rehearsal in any other condition than that of a bride who had accepted the marriage. She confessed that she had heard her daughter weep in the carriage outside St. Thomas Church and had pressed her face to the carriage window and told her that if she did not get out and marry the Duke, the threat against Rutherfurd would be carried out. She confessed that, in everything she had done in 1895, she had broken her daughter's will by methods of which she was now ashamed. She asked the tribunal to grant the annulment. She asked the tribunal to give her daughter the freedom which she, the mother, had taken from her 31 years before. The tribunal granted the annulment in November 1926. The judgment, written by Monsignor William Brown of Westminster, stated that the marriage of November 1895 had been contracted by Consuelo Vanderbilt under grave duress, and was therefore null and void from its inception. The judgment was confirmed by the Holy See in Rome. The Duke was free to marry in the church. He married Gladys Deacon, at the Catholic Church of Notre-Dame de Lorette in Paris on the 25th of January 1927. He took her home to Blenheim. The marriage was, by all accounts, no happier than his first. Gladys lived in the palace for 10 years before he barred her from it in 1933 after a series of quarrels involving spaniels and a revolver. He died at Blenheim in 1934. He did not see Gladys again. She survived him by 43 years and ended her life in a psychiatric hospital in Northamptonshire in 1977, in her bedroom at St Andrews, telling stories about Proust to the nurses. The annulment had a profound effect on Consuelo and her sons. The 10th Duke, Bert, was by then 30 years old. He had been in his middle 20s when his mother's testimony was given. He could not forgive the testimony. The Catholic Church, in deciding that the marriage had never validly existed, was not declaring his civil legitimacy void. The English law of legitimacy was unaffected. He was still the 10th Duke of Marlborough. But to his mind, the testimony of his mother and his grandmother had said, in church and in writing, that his parents' marriage had been a sham. He did not speak to his mother for 6 years. Consuelo, who had hoped that the annulment would close the chapter, found that it had reopened it. She went to America in 1927 and lived with Alva for the last 6 years of her mother's life. They lived quietly. They wrote together. Alva died in Paris in January 1933, aged 80. Consuelo was at her bedside. The last word her mother spoke was her daughter's name. The reconciliation with Bert came in 1933 after Alva's funeral. He visited his mother at her house in Long Island. They talked for a long time in the garden. They were photographed together for the first time in a decade at the New York Opera in 1934. They wrote letters every week for the remaining 30 years of Consuelo's life. He died in 1963 at the age of 65. His mother survived him by 13 months. She wept at his funeral at Blenheim, by the grave that would be her own. Chapter 11. The French Years and the Quiet Happiness. For the first time in her life, she lived in a house she had chosen. The years between 1921 and 1940 were, by Consuelo's own account, the happiest of her life. She and Jacques Balsan lived first at the Château de Loussouet, a small house on the slopes of the village of Aise in the Alpes-Maritimes. They had bought the house in 1922. It had 10 rooms. It had a garden of cypress and oleander. It looked down on the Mediterranean. Consuelo, who had spent 24 years in a house of 187 rooms, considered the 10 rooms perfect. They divided the year. Spring and summer at Loussouet, autumn at their second house, the 17th century Manoir de Saint-Georges Motel in Normandy. Winter in Paris, in an apartment on the Avenue Charles Floquet, which looked out across the Champ de Mars to the Eiffel Tower. The pattern repeated, with small variations, for 19 years. Loussouet became the centre of a small literary circle. The novelist Edith Wharton, who had loved Consuelo in her youth in Newport and admired her now in her freedom, visited often. The composer Cole Porter and his wife Linda came down from Paris. Bernard Berenson came over from his villa near Florence. The conversations were in French and English. They were about books, about painting, about gardens, about people. They were not about Blenheim. The palace, in the years at Loussouet, slowly receded from Consuelo's interior life. It became a memory, no longer the central one. It became a house she had lived in, no longer the house she had been. She painted in those years in watercolour. She read, in those years, voraciously. She corresponded, in those years, with everyone she had ever known. The letters she wrote to her sons are the most numerous of all her papers. The boys came to stay. Bert came reluctantly after the reconciliation. Iva came warmly. Iva's wife, a Romanian beauty called Elizabeth Cunningham, became one of Consuelo's closest friends. They had 4 grandchildren. Consuelo, who had not been permitted to mother her own sons, was permitted to grandmother her grandchildren. She did so with a quiet greed for their company. At Saint-Georges Motel in Normandy, in the autumn of 1937, Consuelo entertained the Prime Minister of England, Stanley Baldwin, who had recently retired. She entertained Anthony Eden, who would later be Foreign Secretary and Prime Minister. She entertained Winston Churchill, her first cousin once removed by marriage, and his wife Clementine. She entertained the painter Walter Sickert. She entertained Henry James before his death. She entertained, in the same week, a delegation of French suffragettes and a delegation of English fox hunters. She managed them with the same gentle skill she had once used at the bicentenary banquet at Blenheim. The difference was that, at Saint-Georges Motel, no one held a stopwatch on her smile. In May 1940, the German army broke the French defensive line at Sedan. The French government left Paris. The roads to the west were choked with refugees. Consuelo and Jacques Balsan loaded a single car. They drove from Saint-Georges Motel to the port of Bordeaux. They left France from the harbour of Lisbon. They arrived in New York in July. They had lost 2 houses, a library of 4,000 books, a collection of watercolours, and most of the possessions of their married life. They had brought with them a suitcase of letters. In America, they bought a house in Florida and another in Southampton, Long Island. They settled into the slower rhythms of an American old age. Consuelo continued her charity work. She supported the Free French. She raised money for French refugees. She gave money to British war relief. She crossed the Atlantic only once during the war, in 1944, to visit her sons in England. She returned to America. She did not return to Europe again until 1946. Jacques Balsan died at their house in Florida on the 4th of November, 1956. He was 88 years old. He had been her husband for 35 years and her friend for 50. Consuelo wrote, in a letter to her son, Ivor, that she had been given more happiness in those 35 years than she had been promised in any prayer. She did not say what the prayer had been. Her son knew. In her widowhood, Consuelo moved between her houses in Southampton and Florida. She read. She wrote. She received guests. She wrote, in 1952, the memoir that would carry her story to the world. The book was published in London and in New York under the title The Glitter and the Gold. It was an immediate success. It was reviewed widely. It was read, particularly, by women. The book was not bitter. It was not a settling of scores. It was an account of a life, told with a great economy and a great precision. It described Marble House. It described the locked room. It described the wedding. It described the train. It described the palace. It described the years inside it. It described the escape. It described briefly, with a discretion that left more unsaid than said, the second marriage. It described the reconciliation with her mother. It told the world, for the first time in plain language, what had been done to her. It set the record. It made it impossible after 1952 for the romance of the dollar princesses to be told without her testimony at its centre. The book has remained in print for 70 years. It is the document on which her place in history rests. Chapter 12. The Memoir, the Grave, and the Palace that Remains. She is buried at Blenheim, in the churchyard at the edge of the palace that took her youth. Consuelo Vanderbilt, Madame Jacques Balsan, formerly the 9th Duchess of Marlborough, died at her house in Southampton, Long Island, on the 6th of December, 1964. She was 87 years old. She had been a widow for 8 years. Her sons had predeceased her by 1 year and 2 years respectively. The cause of death was given as natural causes following a brief illness. Her grandchildren were at her bedside. She left instructions that her body should be flown to England and buried in the churchyard at Bladon, on the edge of the Blenheim estate, beside the grave of her elder son. The arrangements were carried out. The body was flown to London. It was taken by hearse to Oxfordshire. It was buried at Bladon on a day of cold winter sunshine. The grave is a simple slab of grey Cotswold stone. The inscription gives her name, her dates, and the words wife and mother. It does not give the title of Duchess. A short distance away, in the same churchyard, lies Sir Winston Churchill, who had died 11 months earlier. The two graves face each other across a path. The Churchill family, the Marlborough family, the Spencer family, the Vanderbilt family, lie in the same small ground at the edge of the same small park. The palace stands a quarter of a mile beyond the trees. Blenheim Palace today is owned by the 12th Duke of Marlborough, James Spencer Churchill, who succeeded his father in 2014. The palace is open to the public on most days of the year. It receives around 850,000 visitors a year. The staterooms are open. The long library is open. The chapel is open. The state bedroom is open. The Italian garden and the water terraces, paid for by the Vanderbilt dowry, are open. The Sargent portrait of Consuelo and her sons, painted in 1905, hangs in the red drawing room. Visitors stop in front of it. The audio guide, in its current edition, tells them who the woman in the portrait is. It tells them the date of her marriage. It does not tell them the date of her wedding day delay. It does not tell them about the carriage. It does not tell them about the locked room. It does not tell them about the train. The audio guide is, by its nature, brief. The visitors move on. They do not, in most cases, know what they have seen. Marble House at Newport survives as a museum run by the Preservation Society of Newport County. Visitors can climb the staircase. They can walk through the gold ballroom. They can enter the dining room of pink Numidian marble. They can climb the staircase to the second floor. They can stand in front of the door of the room at the end of the corridor. The door is the original door. The lock is the original lock. The Preservation Society has not changed them. Visitors who have read the memoir stand longer at that door than at any other in the house. The Sunderland House Hostel for working women near Charing Cross was destroyed in the Blitz in 1940. The site is now an office building. Sunderland House on Curzon Street was sold by Consuelo in 1917 to help fund her war work. It became the Mayfair Hotel. It was demolished after the war. The site is occupied by an office block named for a bank. The Vanderbilt Mansion at 659 Fifth Avenue, in which Consuelo was born, was demolished in 1927. The site is occupied by a department store. The houses at 65th Street and 51st Street, in which she had been raised, are gone. The Glitter and the Gold remains in print. It is published in paperback in London and in New York. It has been translated into French, German, Italian, Spanish, and Polish. It is borrowed from libraries by approximately 3,000 readers a year in the United Kingdom. The majority of those readers are women over the age of 45. The story of Consuelo Vanderbilt has, in the 60 years since her death, become the story by which the entire generation of dollar princesses is remembered. Not because her marriage was the worst. Several were worse. Not because her life after the marriage was the longest. Several lived longer. But because she set the record. She gave the world the account in her own hand. She said what had been done to her. She named her mother. She named her husband. She named her wedding day. She named her prayer. The palace remains. The dukedom remains. The dynasty continues. The roof has been kept on the building since 1922. By the income from the railroad shares the Vanderbilts paid for it. The staterooms are bright with new paint. The footmen no longer wear powdered wigs. The dining table has been shortened. The Duchess's apartments are now a suite of bedrooms in which paying visitors may, for a fee, sleep one night. The fee is £1,500 a night. The bed in which the 9th Duchess slept for 11 years is open to anyone who can afford it. She would have laughed at that. She had, by the end of her life, a long memory and a short patience for the assumptions of the rich. The palace had taken her youth. It had not taken everything. She had walked out of it at the age of 30. She had built a second life of her own choosing. She had freed other women. She had given milk to other people's children. She had loved a kind man for 35 years. She had told her story, in her own words, in her own time. She had been buried, by her own request, not as a duchess, but as a wife and a mother. Her grave, in the small churchyard at the edge of the palace, is the size of any other. There is a final truth in this story, and it is the truth that this channel returns to in every episode. The buildings are built. The buildings stand. The buildings outlive us. They will outlive us all. But the buildings do not know they are standing. The buildings cannot speak. The buildings cannot, in any meaningful sense, remember the people who lived in them. What can speak and what can remember is the human voice that lifts itself in the long evening of a long life to set the record straight. Consuelo Vanderbilt lifted hers. The voice carried. It carries still. The palace is the bigger thing. The voice, in the end, is the more lasting. If this story moved you, hit subscribe so the next one finds you. And tell me in the comments, before you go, what you make of Alva's confession in 1926. Was it a mother repenting? Or a mother who could only repent because the damage was finally undeniable? Share where you are watching from, and which moment in Consuelo's life stayed with you the longest.